Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the Called2B Podcast, where we seek to empower everyday believers to discover and live out their authentic calling in Christ. I'm Reverend Dr. Travis Guzzi. I'm a pastor as well as an ICF-certified life and executive coach and a Gallup Strengths coach. And we are excited to have you here for this once-a-month Everyday Believer segment where we have conversations with everyday believers doing extraordinary things in the kingdom. And today, I have a special guest that I would like to introduce all of you to. He's a longtime friend, Richard Berndt, or as everybody knows him, Chard. And I've known Chard for many, many years. We go back to our days at Camp Perkins, which we'll talk about a little bit. He is a musician. He's a writer. And especially for this podcast, we're taking a look at his calling as a scientist. I think this is especially important because I know in our world today, there are many people who see conflict between faith and science. And so we're going to explore with him how he lives out his calling in Christ as a scientist, and also maybe get into some of these kind of conversations where there seem to be ambiguity and conflict and how he reconciles that, and perhaps might even inspire some of you to live out your calling in these kind of ways as well. Chard, welcome to the Called2B Podcast. Good to have you with us.
Good to have you. It's great, Travis, to talk to you after all these years.
Been a long time.
Reconnect a little bit. Yep. I run into you once in a while, but not much now that you're far away from Idaho.
Yes, yeah. We grew up in Idaho, actually used to run track and cross country. He was a few years older than I am. But
back when we were a little more springy.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you still kind of are springy, though. So
a little bit.
Hey, Chard, good to have you on the podcast. I'd like to have you just take a moment to introduce yourself to our viewing and listening audience and just tell a little bit about your background and your faith journey.
Sure. Well, I'm in my mid-50s right now. I was raised in a Christian home, but not a typical scenario. Not what most people experience, because I was born and raised in Hong Kong. And my dad was a Lutheran Christian missionary originally, and then ultimately was a circuit leader for all the seminaries over there. So I had a little different experience of Christianity, not being in the majority ethnicity of where we worshiped and so forth. Didn't come to the United States till I was 9.
How was that transition for you, coming from being raised in Hong Kong to now suddenly you're in the U.S.?
It was very difficult, extremely difficult culturally. American schools are actually quite mean. And so it was tough. I had to learn how to fit in, and that was a tough transition for sure. As far as my faith journey, though, I was, like I said, I was immersed in it, which some people don't have a good experience with that. Ultimately, I was a pastor's kid in the U.S. For some people, that's too much, and it gives them something to push back against. For me, I count it primarily as a good thing to be immersed in the faith. In particular, even though I don't go to a church now that does traditional hymns per se, that was a big part of my faith journey growing up. I was always very inspired by the multi-dimensional layers of hymns and what they were saying, the way that they were trying to get at the depth of the gospel. Inspired me even at a young age. I enjoyed that. And I think that's a part of why I like writing music now. As far as my faith journey, it really started with spiders and butterflies in Hong Kong.
Spiders and butterflies. There's got to be a story
spiders
behind
and butterflies. I just was turned loose a lot, and there were lots of spiders, which terrified me, but I enjoyed trying to subdue them and catch them and look at them. And then butterflies, I would just kind of go out into this kind of jungle area, and I just remember being amazed at them and trying to catch them too. So trying to catch creatures was actually part of my formative faith years, because I was very introspective, and I'd have a lot of those moments like, wow, just look at this. This is amazing. This is phenomenal. And so in kind of a quiet way, I just remember feeling very blessed that I was a human, not a butterfly, not a spider, but that I could enjoy them. And so this idea of being in this preferred place in the creation was somehow always in me. And I ended up doing some writing about that in years later, writing a book in biology that looked at God's way of classifying and seeing his creation. So that was something that I did during my years later as a teacher. But it started with those butterflies and spiders. So hymns, butterflies, and spiders, that's my formative faith journey.
Right. And I remember, I mean, I when we served at Camp Perkins, and I'd like to talk about that in a second, I remember a story or an analogy you used years ago, and I've used it to this day, of a little boy who asks his mom, Mom, how does God make flowers grow? And then before he can or she can answer, he answers with his own aha discovery. Oh, I know, God works from the inside. And you've always had this interesting connection of seeing creation and beauty and how God works, and lessons from that really are very instructive.
Yeah, that was a big part of the Camp Perkins impact. That was a component of it.
For those who don't know Camp Perkins, could you share a little bit about what Camp Perkins was and how long were you there for?
So Camp Perkins is a Lutheran camp in central Idaho that people from many different churches and non-Lutheran churches would attend. And it was just a big part of my spiritual growth, a big part of me understanding how to serve and the priority of the gospel. And I was there 5 years, 3 years as a counselor, 1 as a program director, and then 1 as a trip or outdoor director and worship leader. So 5 years. And that's where I met my wife, Carrie, who had been coming out there for years prior to that, all the way from the Midwest. So her family had a connection with the camp and would actually migrate out there every year. So pretty formative.
Yeah.
But, I don't know what your experience was. I'd like to know your take on it too, Travis. But for me, I'd say, the first thing was high expectation, just being all in. We would really expect each week to see God work and move in lives. We would have been disappointed if we didn't see that. And there was that very high expectation that God has called us to this role at this time, and it's going to have to happen. And I get that even just reading recently in the book of Acts. I just get that same kind of vibe sometimes from Paul, like just constantly talking up the fact that, hey, this is a calling. This is by God's grace and God's will and his appointment, and this is going to happen. And that's why he was so bold. Or partly why he was so bold. It was partly his personality too, I'm sure. But that expectation was a big impact, and I give a lot of credit to the director, Rob Meyer, who happens to be one of my 2 brother-in-laws from my relationship with Carrie. I give him a lot of credit for setting that expectation. Another thing was the creativity. Not a lot of churches that I grew up in had a lot of creativity or thinking out of the box and how do we reach people. It was more, just going through a liturgical form, which has its merits, but it sure didn't draw in certain people. And so Camp Perkins impacted me in kind of stepping out of my box. I feel like I've always had humor within me, but I've also been very withheld. And so that kind of helped me to jump out and do some stupid stuff and even physical humor, things I would have never done otherwise.
Well, especially a lot of the skits we used to do. Looking back, it's like, not sure how PC they were, but they were fantastic, and they communicated biblical truth.
It was pretty fantastic time. Guitar playing, that's where I had started playing guitar prior to camp, but Camp Perkins was where I was immersed in that. And God used a lady named Cindy Borden to teach me how to play guitar, kind of in a way where I would get out of my own way, just enjoy playing. Time in the mountains, going back to the creation thing, a big part of that was my hanging out with Robert Moore, who you've interviewed before, the artist.
Great man of God, humble, one of my spiritual mentors in life.
Yeah. And somewhere in that time up there, he and I would it must have been before I was really getting close to my future wife, Carrie, because he and I would go out every weekend. Kids would leave. We would jump in a vehicle and we go to the mountains, and we would get back just literally hours before the new round of kids would come. I don't know how we had the energy, but we would go. And I think we did that out of the 11 weeks of that summer. I think we had a big excursion, probably 8 times.
Yeah.
And it was just a chance to talk about those kinds of connections. And there were so many parallels between our spiritual journey and what we were learning and what we were seeing physically in the creation, that we kind of talked about. We would arrive at these parallel ridges, we would call them, important concepts that were true spiritually and in the creation as well, physically. And so we said it would just be so great to teach this way, to set up everything with an experience physically that then would tie to something. So for instance, you find a time when you reach a spring or a waterfall that you've just been dying to have some good water. And that's when you talk about how the psalmist felt in Psalm 42, Psalm 43, panting for the springs of water, and so forth. And I think that's the psalm that has that. Yes, it is. So we called that parallel ridges, and we ended up starting a little backpacking program, and now they just call it Ridges, but that was something that he and I started. So I'd say that was another huge impact for me, is my depth of understanding, because Robert has a very interesting way of thinking. He's a very creative person, and he was able to kind of put my brain in a different direction about what my faith meant. Right. So I can't even really articulate it, but I have a depth of appreciation for God's word that I wouldn't have had without hanging with him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody, I know from my formation up at Camp Perkins, I came up just really an awkward kid, and I'm like, I always joke that, I saw, you and Rob Meyer and Rob Moore and Marty Meyer, and I just felt like a big navel in the body of Christ. I'm like, what in the world am I here for? I don't know my part. And yet, though, I think what you talked about is, one, the faith and expectation that God was going to show up each and every week, each and every day, and kids' lives are going to be transformed, and how to pray for that and anticipate that, to lay everything out, that this was your calling to love and serve that week, to reflect and share the love of Jesus, to be goofy, to try using your gifts in different ways. And I think that the beauty of what camp ministry can be, whether it's Camp Perkins or other camps, is to get people out of their daily lives. And often I kind of talk about, I think that part of where the struggle of faith happens is we are surrounded in our metropolitan city areas where all we do is we look around and we see things created by man. And we don't get that sense of God's fingerprints and his handiwork in the rest of creation. And so we don't have that presence. And I think that's what camp ministries, or what you talked about with Ridges, taking kids out on these backpack trips and see creation, see God's handiwork, and then lessons of scripture that connect to that, I think is so impactful for faith formation.
Yeah. And I think people that live in this natural world that we're supposed to be connected to maybe take for granted that sometimes, what you're saying. They forget how much impact there is, just for some people, even just to see a clear night with stars is a big deal. For a lot of people in the world, that's not something that they get to see because of where they live.
Yeah, but boy, Camp Perkins, so that's a big deal. Probably one of the best places in the U.S. to see stars, the Milky Way.
So glorious. It's beautiful. One other thing, last thing that I had in my, thoughts about Camp Perkins, at least it came to mind initially. I mean, I certainly appreciate that it's where I met my wife, and that's another factor. But I know it's interesting. I think probably the biggest impact of all was the feeling I had at the end of every summer when I had to leave camp, and go back to whatever I was doing at the time, which was for the most part going back to college, going to school. It was telling to me that profound emptiness. It's a painful way to learn, but I just remember thinking, wow, if I'm feeling this much emptiness, what is it that is missing? And it just really made me realize that there are people that have that emptiness. It may not be as acute, but it's just there. And they have it because they are missing fellowship with God, in the presence of God. And we were so immersed in it that it would exaggerate that feeling when you weren't.
Yes.
And so that was really impactful to me. It gave me a little window for a few weeks after I would get out of there, a window where I was more empathetic toward everyday life and how people were having to make their way through it. And then you'd kind of forget about it and get a little bit more in another normal routine. But I just remember that God kind of showed me, or sparked in me, that there was to be positive things out of that empty feeling, that I was supposed to learn from it.
Yeah.
And so that was a big impact for me.
Yeah, sometimes that challenge of being on that mountaintop, you think of Jesus with the disciples at the Mount of Transfiguration, and yet they had to go back down into everyday life again, where it's not glorious and it's not always wonderful. And yet that getting that experience of the mountaintop gives us such an empathy and a passion for people who maybe have never experienced that, and for them to know that same joy and experience as well in God.
Yeah, I think it's important to have those experiences, even though sometimes they're maybe downplayed as emotional, and they aren't the day-to-day living that we also need to master. We need to seek God out of obedience too, not just out of inspiration and motivation. But I think that it is invaluable to have those touch points to go back to say, I remember how God moved. That's also in the Psalm 42 where David pants, for the streams like a deer, is he reflects back on some kind of procession or worship. And he's remembering the days where there was like this point of awareness of God's presence. And I mean, so even though that's difficult, if you don't have that to remember, that's even worse. So I think it's important, like in ministry, to push people into those retreat experiences and to get people out of the city and out of their life once in a while, to sort of take a time out from the cares and the thorns, of the world, and to do that. So Camp Perkins was that and much more for us. And it was great to be used. Like I knew that, when I would bust out the guitar and start leading songs, I knew that it would impact people. And that was an incredible feeling to know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think those mountaintops give us vision and perspective in life for the journey in the valley. And, those are needed. Hey, Chard, I'd like to shift our conversation. So you went into study and the field of the sciences. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that journey and what led you there and your calling to work as a scientist. What's that look like?
Well, it really started with me being interested in engineering and math. And that's what I initially studied. It's mathematics and then engineering. Got my bachelor's degree in engineering at University of Colorado. Was intending to work in that field. Actually, my biggest interest was sound engineering, actually. But I was willing to work in any field, but it just didn't come together. It was kind of a recession year, and all the jobs that were offered, all of a sudden, all the people that would interview on campus were all just from large cities and the kinds of jobs where you'd be traveling about every month, and I just wanted take carry and go to the Northwest and, live in Idaho or Washington or, Utah or just somewhere up in the mountains. And those were none of the places I were interviewed. So kind of the long story short of that is because of the camp experience and being comfortable doing ministry, a youth pastor position came up at a church in Twin Falls, Idaho. And so we moved there. And then that led to me realizing that the part I liked about that was the teaching more so than the administration. And so then the opportunity came to be a part of a Christian school that was starting. And then I did that for 8 years. And then another school needed me. And so I ended up going to another Christian school for another 10 years. So,
and what kind of field were you teaching? What was your topic?
And I was teaching the sciences mostly.
Okay.
Of course, at small schools, you do a little of everything. So I was coaching, I was teaching writing, I was in charge of the student council for a while, and I was teaching whatever they needed, but the emphasis was science. And so I had the engineering background, so it made me comfortable teaching science and teaching math. I taught math as well. So it was interesting going from engineering to youth pastoring to teaching, and then all the summer jobs that go with trying to survive as a Christian school teacher, because I really did not make much money. And so I learned how to put in sprinkler systems, and I did some roofing and some other construction stuff to make ends meet. So it came to a point where teaching had run its course for me. And that's kind of a whole other conversation. It has a little bit to do with the culture of education as well. But it also has to do with the fact that my son Eli was graduating his senior year. And I basically started teaching when he was in kindergarten. And so his life was running that course. I was losing some of the passion day to day of teaching and not being as filled by my work. And I was just at a point where I wanted to sort of skip the middleman being students, impacting them so they could impact the world. But I was like, I want to do this more directly. Mm-hmm. I want to get into industry. I want to do something where I know that the result of what I'm doing is directly affecting something positively, instead of having to wait 10 years and find out indirectly that I had an impact through someone. I just want to do something with my hands and just do something. And so there was a bit of a crisis there in my life. I was about 45 at the time. And I just wanted to have that direct impact. And what got me into the science was really just God opening the right doors. I knew I wanted to do something that used my mind, and I wanted to do something that was technical, involving math or engineering or science. But it was really just a cool series of events where God got me into an agricultural lab. And I started just as a route driver, picking up samples, grinding hay, doing a lot of boring things. But he had all this interesting equipment lying around because the boss was very forward thinking, and he wanted to try out a lot of stuff. And so I started asking, well, what's this? What's this? He's like, I'm glad you asked. It's the next thing I know, he's just allowing me to take over more and more research. And the joy of that was just the learning curve. Like it was exciting to feel like I was at the front end again of a career, like the feeling in your 20s when you're you're enthusiastic and everything's ahead of you.
Yeah.
You don't feel that when you're in a field for 18, 20 years. And so I was starting to feel that again, like everything's ahead of me again. It's very exciting. And so some people were like, well, isn't it difficult? Or how do you learn that so quick? I'm like, well, I went to engineering school. It's not that intimidating. It's just, it's great. It's fun. I mean, then I even relearned some new programming because programming had changed since I had done computer stuff. So I took some courses and it was just fun. I mean, it was not work. It was work, but it was not tedious.
And right.
Yeah. So next thing you know, I'm just working my way up in this lab and and doing science, and by that I mean helping the probably the biggest outcome is helping the dairy industry to be more productive and for basically for cows to be happier and healthier, which makes everyone happy.
Well, as
So
they
they
say
get
in
better.
California, happy cows, happy life or something. I don't know.
Well, that's true, and that comes down to the feed, and so there's a lot of ins and outs with how do you evaluate feed rations and how do you test them and so forth.
Yeah.
So not so much on the nutrition side. That's what my boss does. My boss is a nutritionist, but on the testing side, I just worked out a lot of stuff and worked out a lot of stuff for him, and he was excited that I was enthusiastic
Yeah. Yeah.
To innovate. He wanted someone that wanted to innovate, and I was in the mood for that for sure.
Awesome. Great. Hey, Chard. So part of our podcast is we explore this idea of calling and vocation, and especially, Martin Luther's kind of the guy when it comes to that. And for him, he said, all of our vocations in life are about loving and serving our neighbor. And the mystery is that in a hidden way, like a mask, God works behind, where it's not just us loving and serving neighbor, but it's God who's loving and serving and bringing his blessing and provision through our vocations. As you think about living out your vocation as a scientist, how do you see God using you to be a blessing to others?
Yeah, I think, there's two parts to the whole working as a scientist thing. The one part is this very tense idea out there that science is at odds with faith. And fortunately, I don't have to navigate that much in my lab work. And there's a lot of scientists out there that never have to be involved in that controversy. The problem is at the educational level, before I got into this lab work, when I was studying for my master's degree, which was science education, the problem is at that level, you realize that there's a whole religious institution out there, just like you would think of a church that has like a pope and a bishop, and you have this hierarchy of structure, and you have authority that goes top down. Well, that's what happens in science. You have this whole institution where you are to believe certain things, and it is not. It may be objective when you get into the lab or into certain research or statistics, but it's not objective in all the assumptions that undergird it. Those assumptions are things that are not provable, and they're assumptions that everyone has to start with, such as, and again, I'm just talking more about the controversial side, but I'll get to the practical side of my faith living out. But this is something I had to deal with when I was studying, because I was writing about it, and you'd have a huge divide between the materialistic scientists and the minority of the educational and writing scientists, the ones that weren't just in the lab getting work done, but the ones that were doing the writing and influencing. The minority was those that were theistic, that believed that God was at the source of it. So you were kind of forced, like, to be a scientist is to reject the idea of God. And that's just so incredibly wrong and ironic, because the reason we have the rational science we have today is entirely because of people pursuing God's truth and believing that it emanates from God. So it's assumptions, and that's the frustrating part. If you start with a statement like all cats can talk, you can make a very accurate and valid syllogism from that. You can say all cats can talk, and Jamie is my cat, therefore Jamie talks. Well, that's a valid argument. There's no problem with that argument, other than the fact that the premise is wrong. It's not true that all cats can talk. And that's what scientists are doing these days. They're doing lots of rational work with untrue and unproven starting points.
Yeah. I think people don't realize that sometimes the assumptions that you begin with has an influence in the conclusions that you'll draw.
Yeah. And so real quick on that. So I was talking about it being like a religion. So if you're a biologist and you believe that everything formed from a single cell on its own accord without guidance from God, there's no creator, and we're here without a purpose through evolution, other than survival. And someone says, well, why do you really believe that against this or that evidence? There's order, there's kinds that reproduce after themselves. There's this discontinuity. Why do you believe all this continuity? They would say, well, let's look at the chemists or the physicists, and they would go up the ladder to the higher authority. And the higher authority is that biochemist is going to say, well, here's the real argument at this level. And then if you challenge that person, they're going to go, well, you go up to the next authority and you start talking to, the astronomers. I mean, these guys, they're the high priests. They got robes on. They don't have robes on, but they may as well, because no one at these lower disciplines would ever challenge an astronomer who can talk big bang talk. Because how do you even explain all this crazy stuff about quantum physics? How do you even talk that language? You can't. And so therefore you're inferior, and you trust what they say because they're just smarter than you. And so you have this whole thing. It's like name dropping, but it's more like positions, and I see it like a hierarchy. And just like it was wrong in the past has always been wrong for people to use power in the church to make people say they have to believe something without letting them have access to God directly, just like that was a problem back in Luther's day. The science thing is a problem now because people aren't allowed to question certain things. And that's ultimately the issue. It's not about science versus religion. It's about the fact that science in practice is another religion.
Yeah. Which science should be, it's the pursuit of truth. I always kind of explain, faith or religion, for us, it's our faith in Christ, explains the why. Why are we here? Why did the world begin? The science helps us understand the how things work in God's created order. And in some ways they're answering different questions.
Right.
But yet sometimes I think, it's kind of like a paradox that is, sometimes there's ambiguity, sometimes it looks like it conflicts, but they're really answering different questions. But I think if the problem, I think what you're saying is sometimes science that should be focused on the how things work tries to answer the why sometimes, and that's where some of the problems happen.
Yeah. And if you had qualified it and said, given this assumption, this is our conclusion, that would be more fair. But a lot of times science is presented as, well, everyone would assume this. The assumptions implied that that's a part of science. And it's not necessarily true. There's nothing more scientific about starting with the assumption that God couldn't do it or didn't do it than starting with the assumption that God could do it or did do it. So, yeah. And fortunately, like I said, in my work, this doesn't come up. It did come up a lot as a teacher. And, to be honest, I'm kind of glad to not be in that apologetic mode anymore right now. It was very tiring having to have these conversations. And when I wrote my book, it was controversial in both camps. And that's a complicated thing too. Like there are evolutionists that said, of course, that makes sense what you wrote. That's consistent. There are other ones that said, well, it's ridiculous. And there's believers that said, of course you would write that. I've been waiting for someone to write something about that. Then there were believers that said, that's ridiculous. So it's an interesting, it was a tough time, and I think it goes on. And there are people that are called to that. There are people that are called to the apologetics of helping people to get out of those traps of education and of where education is the God, or the establishment, the scientific establishments of God. And there are people that really do need to be persuaded about those arguments that show that creation has merit scientifically, and that evolution has deficiencies scientifically. And there are people that need to get in those trenches, and they are messy trenches. For me, that's not what I'm doing anymore. And so I do science on a regular basis, meaning that I take data and I make sense of it, and I give people information that they need to make more decisions. And data is powerful, and I love that part of it. And as far as my Christian role in that right now, I would say at one level, it's like when I worked as a night cook at Perkins Restaurant in college. It's just being kind and humble with the people you work with, the ones you work under, being respectful, the ones you work over, being gracious to them as well. So at all levels of those relationships in the workplace, there can be conflict, and wearing the cross, being Christ, is so valuable in a workplace.
Yeah.
And I remember just being a believer, not even trying to evangelize at Perkins Restaurant as a cook, just being in Christ had an impact to where I'd go to the break room and people would join me and want to talk and tell me their problems.
Yeah.
And I was not advertising that I'm an extrovert or care to talk to people. I was just wanting to go get a cup of coffee, but they saw something there, and that just surprised me. Well, now I realize, how important those little things are. And that's one of the ways I'm a Christian in my workplace is there's a lot of stress when people are depending on your lab test, or when they want something now, not tomorrow. Or when you're trying to solve through confusion, trying to work out a problem, that there needs to be a balm, a calming influence in that, and Christ can be that. And I do believe it's like that, like it's wearing the cross. I started wearing the cross again this last few years ago. I don't know why I never did, but started wearing one. And then I remembered there was a Michael W. Smith song called Cross of Gold. I don't know if you remember that. And in the song, he's just kind of challenging someone who's wearing the cross as fashion. Why are you wearing that? Do you realize what that really is about? And I just remember those lyrics. And that's kind of why I started wearing the cross again, is I feel like I want to wear the cross, and figuratively. And it reminds me when I just feel it dangling there. It reminds me that I wear the cross. It's like Philippians 2, being willing to be of low position to serve others, being humble. Wearing the cross is that thing of saying, I'm not just a believer in Jesus, but I try to follow him. And so that's the biggest thing in the workplace. And then the one other thing with that is the ethics. Working in science, it is very easy to cheat, to massage data, to manipulate statistics. So many times you have to resolve, okay, I'm going to do this in the most ethical and right way, not for the gain of this company I work for, and not for the gain of myself, but because it's right. And that's a big part. And that's maybe a part that's a little more acute than like when I was flipping burgers, at Perkins. There can be a lot at stake when you're working with data and information. And that was true in education too, as a teacher. But yeah, how am I a Christian as a scientist? A lot of it is, am I doing this in a way that has integrity with the information that I'm looking at? So.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing that. Hey, Chard, we're kind of getting to the end of our podcast. What I'd like to do is just maybe end with this question. We may have some young people who are thinking about going in the sciences or listening and viewing audience. What advice would you give to them? And especially where, again, there's some of that struggle that seems to be this faith and science, can it coexist together? What would just be kind of briefly some counsel you would offer?
Yeah, I think a few things. As far as the foundations, the assumptions, creation and so forth, I would just encourage the person that wants to get into that field, since it's a pursuit of truth. I would encourage them to not just debate about the word or what people say about it, but to read it. The first thing I would say is, have you really sat down with an open mind and read the creation account? Because it's remarkable, not only the way it reads, but the way it flows into the rest of the story in the Bible. It's just phenomenal. It's a great narrative. And there's so much inspiration that comes from the specifics of that. And so I would say start with that. If you have any part of you that thinks that you're on the defensive because you want to follow God and everyone else knows more and knows better, just open up and say, hey, they actually could be deceived, and jump in there and read the word. And that's including all the references to the creation throughout the Bible, which Jesus speaks about it too in the New Testament. Secondly, I would say, practically speaking, you want to be a scientist, make sure it is in your wheelhouse. You need to be good at statistics and math. If you're not good at mathematics, you're probably going to be frustrated as a scientist. That's kind of a part of it, especially these days with the amount of data that gets processed. And spreadsheets, not just like simple ones. You need to be able to master those things. You need to be able to write code that programs what they do. And you could probably do it, but you just have to understand that unless you are good at the numbers stuff, it's going to be frustrating. So I would say, make sure, if you're just inquisitive about nature and so forth, it's probably not scientist or lab work that you're going to be passionate about. You're probably going to need to find a different outlet for that. And there are other outlets to explore nature and to be like a biological scientist or so forth. But if you're actually going to get into the technical part of it, there's no way getting around. You got to be comfortable with math, which you can learn too if you want to.
Yeah.
And then I would say lastly on that is just think outside the box, challenge assumptions. That's what got science going in the first place, in the Renaissance. It's thinking outside the box, challenging what everyone said was the way it is. Not only on the big scale, being willing to go toe to toe with people that are trying to leave God out of the picture, but even at a small scale in your work, in a lab or whatever, there's probably a very cool solution to something that nobody has thought about. Or there's probably a way to simplify a problem that is complex. I really believe in the idea that God cuts through confusion and he brings clarity. And I've loved that in my job, being able to take this complex problem of going from data flow at the beginning of what a customer gives us and what they give us to test, all the way to what they get back in a report. And there's a lot of things that happen with instrumentation and with testing in between there. And I love the idea of when it works seamlessly and when it makes sense. It's a beautiful thing to me. There's an order there. And that's part of what I enjoy about the job. There's a lot of challenges, and my job has changed. My scientist job has changed over the years, and it has challenged and stretched me. But the joy is being able to be creative, even in something that's technical and mathematical. Be creative, think out of the box. It's a great feeling to be able to come up with a solution for something. So those are some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Chard, it was great catching up with you. Thank you for sharing about your faith journey, sharing about what you do, what you did as a teacher and that calling, and your calling as a scientist. I think it was very inspirational to see this integration of calling and work and faith. And I know, unfortunately, we don't have time today. You've got a mission trip coming up. Real quickly, where are you heading to?
Heading to Nepal. And Nepal, and to some kind of remote regions of Nepal that don't have much Christian influence. They do have some, but it's sparse, and it's a place that has great needs. And fortunately, there's some wonderful connections that have been made in the past by some of the people I'm going with. So doors are open, opportunities are there. And it's my first time going into that part of the world to do such a thing. So
yeah, well, your experience in the mountains, it seems like a natural place for you. I would love to have you back on, maybe to hear a little bit about that mission trip. If anybody wants to support you, how could they get in touch with you? Or maybe they got questions about science and how to get involved. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
Probably the best way would be to drop me an email. It's chard.berndt@gmail.com. So chard.berndt@gmail.com. Just, tell me what you want to talk about or so forth. So we can talk about that. The mission trip. I actually don't need any more funds at this time. God has provided that and more. Just need prayer for tendons all around, tendons in my foot, tendons in my hand.
Well, especially as we get older, that's a very important prayer.
In fact, the listeners could just pray for Travis and me in general for the tendons and soft tissues because we're old.
That's right. That's right. Hey, Chard, thanks so much. God's blessings. Thanks for joining us. And we look forward to maybe catching up and hearing about this mission trip here soon.
Yeah, I would love to follow up. I would enjoy talking about that and exploring a few other things. Of course, there's not enough time to get to everything because God's doing a lot of work in our lives, but there's more to talk about. So yeah, if you'd have me on again, I would be more than willing.
Sounds great. Hey, thanks, and God's blessings to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Travis.
Okay. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us for this Everyday Believer conversation for the Called2B podcast. We thank Chard, Richard Berndt, for joining us, talking about faith and science, and hopefully this was an inspiration for you. We need people going into the sciences, people who honor God, His beautiful creation, and just want to help understand how that works and its practical applications for everyday life and love and service. If you are interested in maybe exploring that, what that might mean for your life, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to do some coaching with you around that. You can reach out to me at called2bpodcast@gmail.com. That's called2bpodcast@gmail.com. Hey, make sure not only to like this podcast, our video and audio version, but also share it with somebody, especially somebody you might know who is interested in faith and science and what that might mean for their future. As always, we want to thank Malem in the Southeastern District for their generous gifts that made this podcast possible. And with that, I want to wish you all God's richest blessings, and we'll catch you next time for the Called2B podcast. Take care, everybody.